The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a bruised purple over the sky as the 4 cars slowly snaked their way up the narrow road, each one swallowed by the shadows of the trees that lined the path to Crowhurst House. The mansion had loomed over the town for decades, a dark, oppressive silhouette against the skyline, as though it were watching, waiting. People said it had been abandoned for years, but that didn't stop the rumors. Whispers of strange noises, flickering lights, and shadows that slithered past the windows at night. For most, the house was an unsettling relic of a forgotten past, something to avoid. But not tonight. Tonight, the house had guests. Evan was the first to arrive, parking his car near the rusted iron gates that barely hung onto their hinges. He stepped out, the dry crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. He lit a cigarette, the flickering flame momentarily revealing the nervous twitch of his hands. He had always been drawn to the unknown, to the thrill of the supernatural. But now, standing here with the mansion looming over him, he felt something gnawing at the back of his mind. It was almost like regret, a sensation he was not used to, and certainly not comfortable with. He glanced at the crumpled invitation in his pocket, the message scrawled in neat, delicate handwriting. "Face what has been hidden, or let it consume you." He had laughed when he first read it, assuming it was a prank, some local legend being milked for entertainment. But something in him couldn't let it go, couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to this invitation than just a scare. Maybe it was the way the words seemed to sink into his mind, or maybe it was the desperate need for an adrenaline rush that drowned out his quieter, darker thoughts. Either way, he was here, and now so were they. The next to arrive was Lena. She pulled up with a screech, her car stereo still blasting some upbeat pop song as if to ward off the creeping chill that permeated the air. She stepped out, her eyes immediately darting around, searching for any sign of movement, her camera already in hand. This was supposed to be her moment. The big reveal, the night she would finally capture something real on camera, prove once and for all that the supernatural was just smoke and mirrors. She had her channel, Lena's Exposés, where she debunked myths, haunted tales, and ghost stories. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and this video could be the thing that put her on the map. But as she stood there, the wind tugging at her hair and the mansion looming in the distance, she felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Her hand instinctively went to the back of her neck, rubbing at a spot that always ached when she was stressed. She had been having nightmares again, dark, vivid dreams that left her gasping for air. Dreams she couldn't explain and didn't want to. But she had convinced herself that they were nothing, just nerves about tonight. She had to believe that. She had to believe that this was just another haunted house, just another night, and nothing more. Marcus arrived soon after, slinking out of his car with a nervous glance over his shoulder. He looked at the mansion with a mixture of awe and dread, his mind racing with calculations. The invitation had promised money, a substantial amount for anyone who could make it through the night. He didn't have many options left. His debts were piling up, the phone calls were getting more frequent, more threatening. He wasn't proud of it, but he had taken out loans from the wrong people, people who didn't care about excuses. This was a chance to get out from under that crushing weight, to breathe again. But he had to survive the night first. He had been told stories about Crowhurst House growing up, but he had never paid much attention. He wasn't the type to scare easily, or at least he didn't think he was. But as he stood there staring at the darkened windows, He felt an odd sensation, like he was being watched, like there was something out there just beyond his line of sight, waiting for him to step closer. He pushed the thought aside, straightening his jacket, trying to look more confident than he felt. Tonight was his chance, and he wasn't going to let a few ghost stories stand in his way. The last to arrive was Nina. She parked her car a little further down the road, almost as if she didn't want to be seen. She walked slowly, taking her time, her eyes fixed on the mansion as if trying to read its secrets from a distance. She had been quiet when she received the invitation, slipping it into her bag without a word. The others hadn't known what to make of her, this shy, reserved girl who had barely spoken during their initial meeting. But she was here, and something in her eyes suggested she knew more than she was letting on. She had always been drawn to dark places, to the hidden corners of the world where shadows lingered, and this house was no different. But there was something else, something personal, something she couldn't quite explain even to herself. She stopped a few feet from the others, her gaze lingering on the old, twisted vines that clung to the walls, the way they seemed to pulse slightly, as if in rhythm with a heartbeat she could not hear but could feel deep within her chest. She had been here before, or at least she thought she had. There were flashes of memories, images that slipped through her mind like water, impossible to grasp but too vivid to dismiss. The others were talking, but she couldn't focus on their words, only on the strange dark shape of the house and the way it seemed to bend and shift as she stared at it. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and for a moment the air felt colder, sharper, like the edge of a blade. The four of them stood together, silent, each lost in their own thoughts, their own reasons for being there. The mansion loomed before them, its windows dark, its doors shut tight, as if daring them to enter. But then, as if in response to their presence, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing a yawning black void within. It was not an invitation, it was a challenge, a test. And they all knew, without saying a word, that there was no turning back now. Evan took a step forward, his cigarette burning down to a nub between his fingers. "Well," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet, "we're not going to get anything done just standing out here, are we?" Lena hesitated, glancing at the others, but she raised her camera, turning it on with a click. "I'm recording everything," she said, her voice steady, almost defiant. "Whatever happens, we'll have proof." Marcus didn't say anything, just shoved his hands into his pockets and followed Evan. Nina was the last to move, her eyes lingering on the house one last time before she stepped forward, almost as if she was afraid of what she might find, but more afraid of turning away. The doors groaned as they pushed them open wider, and one by one they stepped inside, swallowed by the darkness. The air was thick, musty, like the smell of an old cellar that had been sealed for too long. And as the doors swung shut behind them, locking with a resounding thud, they were left standing in a vast, empty foyer, the shadows stretching around them like hungry, grasping fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime, each slow, deliberate toll echoing through the halls. Midnight. The house was awake now, and so were they. The foyer was vast and silent, like the belly of a beast that had swallowed them whole. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old blood. The walls, once grand and adorned with dark wood paneling, were now cracked and peeling, as though the house was shedding its skin. A large, spiraling staircase rose ahead of them, winding up into darkness, and doorways opened up to rooms that seemed to stretch into oblivion. The The shadows pooled at their feet, stretching and curling as if reaching out, eager to swallow them. Evan was the first to speak, breaking the uneasy silence. "All right, let's split up. We cover more ground that way." He spoke with a forced bravado, trying to mask the nervous tremor in his voice. "Check the place out, see if there's anything interesting." Lena shot him a look, her brow furrowing. "Split up? Are you serious?" She raised her camera, panning it slowly across the room, catching glimpses of the darkened hallways and the flickering lights. "Haven't you seen any horror movie ever? That's how people end up dead." Evan shrugged, trying to play it off. "You said it yourself. Nothing's going to happen. So what's the harm?" But even as he spoke, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. He didn't know why he had suggested it. It was as if the idea had been planted in his head, a whisper he couldn't quite remember hearing. The house seemed to want them apart, and without even realizing it, he was playing right into its hands. "Fine," Lena said, rolling her eyes, "but I'm keeping this camera on, and if something jumps out at me, I'm running. No questions asked." They all exchanged a brief, nervous laugh, but it was strained, the kind of laugh that cracks when fear is just beneath the surface. Marcus glanced at the staircase, feeling a strange pull toward it, like a hook snagging on the back of his mind. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt it too. The compulsion, the need to move deeper into the house, to see what lay hidden in its darkened corners. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, already heading toward one of the hallways. "The sooner we look around, the sooner we can get out of here." The house seemed to shift around them as they moved, the walls closing in, narrowing the hallways and expanding the rooms. The floor creaked under their feet, groaning with each step, as if the house was exhaling. Shadows twisted on the walls, stretching out longer than they should, creating shapes that seemed to ripple and move on their own. Evan found himself wandering down a narrow hallway that led to a room at the back of the house, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. As he entered, he saw what looked like a study, filled with old, dusty books and cobwebs that hung from the ceiling like curtains. The air was colder here, and as he walked further in, he noticed a strange, rhythmic sound, a low, wet thumping noise like a heartbeat. He hesitated, then took a step closer to the desk in the center of the room. The noise grew louder, more insistent, and he realized it was coming from the walls. He pressed his ear against the wooden paneling, and for a moment he could swear he felt the faintest pulse, as if the house was breathing, its walls expanding and contracting in a slow, labored rhythm. He jerked back, stumbling, his heart pounding. He had always been fascinated by the paranormal, but this was different. This felt wrong. Meanwhile, Lena found herself drawn to a room on the second floor. It was once a child's bedroom, the faded wallpaper adorned with patterns of stars and moons. Toys were scattered across the floor, their once bright colors dulled by time, their eyes blank and glassy. The air was thick with dust, but it was more than that. It felt heavy, almost suffocating. She raised her camera, but the lens fogged over, and she wiped it clean with a shaky hand. As she panned the room, she caught sight of something in the corner, a rocking chair, its back turned to her. It was moving slowly, back and forth, the floorboards creaking with each motion. She blinked, her heart racing, but the chair continued to rock, even though there was no one sitting in it. She took a cautious step forward, and as she did, the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending and curving, pulling away from her. It felt like the room was alive, breathing, and with each breath the space around her warped and distorted, as though she was looking through a lens that was being twisted. She took a step back, but her foot hit something solid, and she turned to see a doll lying at her feet. Its eyes were wide open, staring up at her, and as she watched, its mouth slowly opened, a dry, cracking sound filling the room. "Lena." The voice was a whisper, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was her own voice. She dropped the doll, stumbling backward, her camera swinging wildly as she tried to regain her footing. The chair stopped rocking. The room fell silent, but she could still hear the whisper echoing in her mind, repeating her name over and over like a chant. Down in the basement, Marcus wandered through the dark, his flashlight flickering. The air was damp, thick with the smell of rot and decay. He tried to focus, but his thoughts were scattered, his mind drifting back to the phone calls, the threats, the fear that had driven him here. He had hoped to find something, anything that would make this night worth it, but all he found was more darkness, more shadows. As he moved deeper into the basement, he stumbled across an old wooden chest. The wood was warped and splintered, but there was something about it, something that compelled him to open it. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside was a pile of old, yellowed photographs, each one showing different people, all posed in front of the house. Some of the faces were blurred, others too dark to make out, but one thing was clear. They were all staring straight at the camera, their eyes wide, their expressions frozen in fear. As he flipped through the photos, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. There, at the bottom of the pile, was a photograph of him. He was standing in front of the house just like the others, but his expression was different. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't scared either. He looked empty, hollow, as if there was nothing left inside him. He dropped the photo, stumbling back, his flashlight flickering and casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. And then, from the darkness, he heard a voice, deep, raspy, and echoing through the basement, almost as if the house itself was speaking. "You've come to pay your debt, Marcus." Upstairs, Nina wandered through the empty halls, her footsteps light, almost silent. She was different from the others. She had not come for thrills, or proof, or money. She had come because she had been called, because she had felt the pull long before the invitation arrived. She moved through the house as if she knew its secrets, her hand brushing lightly against the walls. As she walked, she began to hum, a soft, familiar lullaby that echoed down the corridor, growing louder with each step. She stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, a door that was unlike the others. It was old, the wood dark and polished, and there was no handle, no keyhole, just a small brass plaque engraved with a single word, Sanctum. She reached out, pressing her palm against the wood, and felt a warmth beneath her hand, a slow, steady pulse that beat in time with her own heart. The house was breathing, and she could feel it deep within her, as if the walls and floors were alive, pulsing with a dark, ancient energy. "Soon," she whispered, her voice barely audible, lost in the quiet hum of the house. "Soon, it will be complete." The night dragged on, the darkness pressing in from all sides, and the house shifted around them, creaking and groaning as it settled into place. Each of them was drawn deeper, led by whispers, shadows, and the unspoken promise of something terrible waiting just out of sight. They were not alone, and they all knew it. The house was watching, waiting, and with every breath they took, it seemed to breathe with them, as if drawing them closer, luring them deeper into its dark, twisted heart. Somewhere, deep within the house, a clock began to tick, slow and deliberate, each beat resonating through the walls like a heartbeat. The house was alive and it was hungry. The clock struck 3. The sound echoed through the halls, reverberating like a pulse, slow and rhythmic, and each chime felt like it was sinking deeper into the bones of the house's occupants. By now, the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of damp wood and something far more rotten, something sweet and sickening that stuck to the back of the throat. The house was changing. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the mansion itself was a living, throbbing entity, and they were trapped inside its ribcage. Evan's footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as he stumbled through the dark, his flashlight flickering erratically. He had separated from the others, but it didn't matter anymore. He barely remembered why they had come or why he was still wandering. All he could think about was the voice, that mocking, taunting voice that kept calling out to him from the shadows, whispering his name in a tone that was both familiar and entirely alien. It slithered through his mind, hissing and coiling, growing louder until it was all he could hear. "Evan," it crooned, soft and saccharine. "Why do you run? You can't hide from me." He turned a corner and the hallway seemed to stretch, elongating, the walls warping as if bending around him. His reflection appeared in a mirror on the wall, but when he looked closer, the reflection didn't match his movements. It stared back at him with eyes wide and frantic, a twisted smile tugging at its lips, even as his own mouth remained still. And then the reflection leaned forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to break through. "Coward," it spat, the word dripping with venom. "You've always been a coward. It's why she died." Evan recoiled, his chest tightening, his breath ragged. He remembered the accident, the screams, the way the world had blurred as he tried to run away, to escape the guilt that gnawed at him even now. The mirror cracked, spider webs of fractures splintering across the glass, and for a moment he thought he saw something else behind the reflection, a dark, writhing mass, shifting and pulsing, as if something was moving just beneath the surface of the mirror. Then, with a sickening pop, a single, pale hand burst through the glass, grasping at the air, reaching for him. Evan screamed and stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The light flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. But the hand kept reaching, fingers curling and uncurling, beckoning him closer. And from somewhere deep within the house, he heard it again. That heartbeat, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds to something inevitable. Lena was on the 3rd floor, her camera still recording, the red light blinking in the dark. She had tried to leave, to find the others, but every time she turned a corner, she ended up back in the same place, the same hallway, the same room. The house was playing with her, twisting the layout until she couldn't tell which way was up. It was like trying to navigate through a maze that kept shifting, walls appearing where there had been none before, doors leading to dead ends or rooms that were not quite right, as if they belonged to a different place entirely. She had given up calling out to the others. The only response she ever got was her own voice, distorted and echoing back at her, repeating her words but not in the same way she had said them. As she wandered, she came across a door she didn't remember seeing before. It was slightly ajar, and from inside she could hear a faint, melodic humming, like a lullaby. She knew she shouldn't open it, but the sound was so familiar, tugging at her memory, drawing her closer. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and for a moment she thought she had stepped back in time. It was a nursery, with pale blue walls and a crib in the corner, toys scattered across the floor. The room was impossibly clean, untouched by the decay that had spread through the rest of the house. But as she approached the crib, she saw that it was empty. The lullaby grew louder, and Lena felt a sudden wave of nausea, a sickening sense of déjà vu. She had heard this song before, in her nightmares, but it wasn't just a song. It was a memory, one she had buried deep, hoping it would stay forgotten. As she stood there, the walls around her began to ripple, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal something dark and fleshy beneath. The toys on the floor twitched, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light, and the room seemed to contract, the air growing thick and oppressive. She turned to leave, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. Panic surged through her, and she raised her camera, desperate to document what was happening, to prove she wasn't losing her mind. But when she looked through the viewfinder, she didn't see the room. She saw herself, standing alone in the dark, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows, a figure loomed, its features twisted and distorted, as if the shadows had taken on a life of their own. It raised a hand, reaching out to touch her, and she could feel the cold, clammy pressure of its fingers on her shoulder, even though she knew there was nothing there. The lullaby grew louder, drowning out the sound of her own breathing, and the figure leaned in close, its lips brushing against her ear. "Remember," it whispered, "you can't hide from the truth." Marcus found himself in the dining room, staring at the long, polished table that stretched out before him, covered in dust and cobwebs. The chandelier above flickered, casting dim, wavering light that made the shadows dance across the walls. He couldn't remember how he had ended up here. One moment he was in the basement, and the next, he was sitting at the head of the table, a glass of dark red wine in front of him. Except it wasn't wine. He could smell it, the metallic tang, and when he looked closer, he saw the dark liquid swirling, thick and viscous, almost like blood. His stomach twisted, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the glass. The room around him seemed to fade, the edges blurring, and he was no longer in the dining room but standing on a street corner, cold rain soaking through his clothes, his hands shaking as he held a crumpled piece of paper. He recognized this place, this moment. It was the night he had made the deal, the night he had sold his soul to escape the debt that was swallowing him whole. He remembered the way the man had smiled, a smile that was all teeth, and the way the shadows seemed to gather around him, cloaking him in darkness. And now, as he looked down at the table, he saw that same smile reflected in the wine glass, the same sharp, predatory grin that had haunted his nightmares. "You thought you could escape," a voice said, low and mocking. "But debts must always be paid." Marcus's head snapped up, and he saw them, the figures standing at the far end of the room, their faces hidden in shadow. But he could see their eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. They stepped forward, one by one, and as they moved closer, their faces became clear. They were his own, twisted and distorted, their mouths stretched into grotesque grins, their eyes empty and hollow. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, and the figures began to merge, melting together into a single, dark shape that loomed over him, suffocating him with its presence. Nina stood in front of the door marked Sanctum, her hand still pressed against the wood. She could feel the pulse, slow and steady, almost hypnotic. The house was alive, and it was calling to her, drawing her in. She could feel its hunger, its need, and she understood now why she had been brought here, why she had been chosen. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The room was vast, impossibly large, with walls that seemed to stretch into eternity. In the center, a large circular mirror stood, its surface rippling like water. She walked toward it, her reflection blurring and shifting, and as she reached out to touch it, the glass parted, revealing something dark and writhing beneath. "Nina," a voice whispered, echoing through the chamber. "You are the key, the vessel. It is time." She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She knew what she was, what she had always been. The mirror rippled and she saw them, Evan, Lena, Marcus, trapped within its surface, their faces contorted with fear, their mouths open in silent screams. They were not just victims, they were offerings, sacrifices to the house's insatiable hunger. And she was the one who would deliver them. The house trembled, the walls shaking, and she could feel its power coursing through her, filling her with a dark, terrible energy. The unveiling was complete. The house had shown them the truth, had stripped away the lies, and now it was time for the final act. Nina smiled, her eyes dark and gleaming, and as she stepped back, the mirror shattered, and the house began to feed. The house was alive, and it was no longer hiding. Walls that once stood firm now shifted and pulsed like the sinew of some great, unseen creature. The air was thick with a suffocating heat, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The shadows that had once clung to the corners now moved freely, writhing like serpents, slithering across the walls and coiling around the four trapped souls within. It was as if the mansion had shed its skin, revealing its true form, dark, pulsating, hungry. Evan, Lena, Marcus, and Nina stood in what had once been the grand foyer, but it was no longer the same. The elegant staircase had warped, twisting upward like a gnarled spine, and the chandelier above swung back and forth, casting fractured, jagged shards of light that danced across the room. The house breathed around them, a low, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of their hearts, and with each breath, it seemed to grow stronger, more solid, as if feeding off their fear. Evan's hands trembled as he backed away, his eyes darting wildly, searching for a way out, but the door was gone, swallowed by the shifting walls. "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if afraid to break the silence that had settled over them. We just have to find a way out." "There is no way out," Nina said softly, her voice calm, almost serene. She stood apart from the others, her eyes dark and empty, her face pale and expressionless. "Not anymore." Lena turned to her, her eyes wide with terror. "What do you mean? We have to get out of here, we have to—" But the words caught in her throat, choked off by a wave of nausea, as the room seemed to spin, the walls closing in, pressing against her, suffocating her. Nina's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, distant certainty. "We're already inside, Lena, and now it's inside us." The transformation was slow, agonizing, and unstoppable. The house began to consume them, and with each passing moment, they felt their bodies betraying them, merging with the twisted architecture around them. Evan looked down at his hands, and his breath caught in his throat. The skin was splitting, tiny jagged cracks spreading across his fingers, and through them he could see dark, pulsing veins that weren't his own. He clawed at his skin, desperate to tear away whatever was beneath. But the more he scratched, the more it hurt, as if he was peeling away his own flesh, layer by layer, and beneath it was not bone, but wood, dark, gnarled, and alive. Lena stumbled, clutching at her throat, her camera clattering to the floor and flickering out. She could feel something crawling beneath her skin, a cold, slithering sensation that twisted its way up her arms and into her chest. Her vision blurred, and she saw her reflection in a cracked mirror across the room. Her eyes were wide, dark, and filled with something she did not recognize. The skin around her mouth began to split, curling back to reveal sharp, jagged teeth that she did not know she had. And she realized with a sickening clarity that the thing staring back at her wasn't her. It was the house looking through her eyes, wearing her face. "Make it stop," Marcus moaned, doubling over, his hands clutching at his stomach as if trying to hold himself together. "Please make it stop." But his voice was drowned out by the low, guttural groan that echoed through the mansion, a sound that came from deep within, resonating through the walls, the floors, the air itself. He could feel it inside him, creeping through his veins, twisting around his bones, and with a jolt of horror, he realized that he was no longer moving on his own. The house was guiding his limbs, bending them, twisting them, as if he were nothing more than a puppet, and he could feel his skin stretching, tearing, as roots pushed their way out, curling around his arms and legs, anchoring him to the floor. Nina watched them, her expression unchanging, as if she were observing a ritual she had seen 100 times before. She was calm, detached, as the house continued to mold and reshape them, stripping away their humanity piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the dark, twisted forms that would join the others that had come before. The house had been waiting for this, waiting for her, and now she could feel it coursing through her, filling her with a power that was both ancient and terrible. "You don't have to fight it," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "It's easier if you don't." Evan turned to her, his eyes wild, filled with pain and fear. "Why?" he choked out, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I was always meant to," Nina replied, and for a moment there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of the girl she had once been. "I tried to resist it, but you can't resist what you are. The house chose me long ago, and I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. It's in my blood, in my soul, and now it's in yours, too." Evan shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks, but his body was no longer his own. His legs buckled and he fell to his knees, the wood beneath him creaking as if welcoming him home. He could feel the roots wrapping around him, pulling him down, and as he looked up, he saw the others, Lena, Marcus, their faces contorted with pain and fear, but their eyes empty, hollow, as if the house had already taken everything that mattered. They were becoming part of it, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The house groaned, the sound reverberating through the walls, and with a sudden violent lurch, the floor beneath them split open, revealing a dark, yawning chasm. From the depths, tendrils of shadow reached up, curling around their limbs, pulling them down, deeper into the dark. Lena tried to scream, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the blackness that enveloped her, and as she was dragged down, she could feel the house inside her mind, whispering, soothing, telling her that it was okay, that she was home, and that soon there would be nothing left to fear. Marcus's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back as the roots pierced through his skin, wrapping around his bones, pulling him apart and piecing him back together, until he was no longer recognizable as the man he had once been. His mouth opened, but instead of a scream, a low, guttural moan escaped, echoing through the empty halls, joining the chorus of voices that had been trapped here for so long. Evan could feel the house tightening around him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. But even as he felt his consciousness slipping away, he could see them. The faces, the eyes, watching him from the walls, from the mirrors, from the dark. They were all here, all the souls that had been consumed by the house, and they were still trapped, still screaming, still alive somewhere deep within the walls. And as he felt himself being pulled into that darkness, he understood what the house truly was. It wasn't just a building, it was a prison, a maw that swallowed everything and never let go, and now he was part of it, forever. Nina stood at the center of the room, the shadows swirling around her, and she could feel the house's joy, its satisfaction, as it claimed its newest inhabitants. The ritual was complete, and the mansion was whole once more, its hunger sated, at least for a little while. She closed her eyes, feeling the power surging through her, and she could hear their voices, mingling with the whispers that had always been there, the voices of all those who had come before. But as she listened, she realized something had changed. The house was not just consuming them, it was merging with them, becoming something more, something stronger. The boundaries between the house and its victims were dissolving, blurring until there was no separation at all. And she understood, with a cold, dawning clarity, that this was only the beginning. The house was no longer content to wait, to lure, to hide. It wanted to grow, to spread, to reach beyond its walls and claim more, and now it had the means to do so. Nina opened her eyes, and they were no longer her own. They were dark, empty, filled with the same endless, insatiable hunger that had driven the house for so long. And as she looked out over the room, she could see the walls shifting, stretching, reaching out into the darkness, searching for the next soul to pull into its grasp. The house had become one with them, and they had become one with the house, and there was no end, no escape, no way out. The mansion was alive, and it was only getting stronger, its heart beating louder, faster, as it prepared to open its doors once more. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the clock began to chime, its tolls slow and deliberate, marking the start of a new cycle. Midnight. The house was ready, and it was waiting, and it would always be hungry.